Hello and welcome to the Association of Assistive Technology Act Program's Information and Communication Technology Accessibility webcast series. I'm your host, Rob Carr, and I work with Oklahoma Able Tech, Oklahoma's Assistive Technology Act program, housed at Oklahoma State University. In this installment of the ICT Accessibility webcast series, we're going to focus on the importance of integrating accessibility into technology procurement and use decisions. If we don't account for accessibility in procurement and use decisions, then we probably put ourselves behind the eight ball when it comes to providing accessible products that people actually use. It is very important to be sure that the platforms and tools that we provide help us to make our digital environments more accessible. If we purchase or use products that don't have good accessibility support, then we put ourselves in a position where we cannot create accessible environments for our consumers to use. This is why we need to be sure that we account for accessibility when we make these decisions. One of the biggest changes that we have seen come along in the last 15 to 20 years is the use of technology not only as a communication tool, but also as a way to allow people to participate in programs, services, and activities that we provide. An example that is timely as we enter into the heart of the presidential election cycle is technology in voting. Many states have begun to look at ways to let people register to vote through the web. This actually creates a lot of amazing opportunities for people with and without disabilities. Instead of having to go to a municipal office building to fill out voting registration paperwork or to download a paper form, fill it out, and mail it, people can register to vote from anywhere that they can connect to the internet. And people can use anything from a smartphone to a high-end desktop or laptop computer. This removes a lot of the barriers that currently exist in getting people to register to vote. The hope with these efforts is to involve more people in the voting process. But as we move from an environment where voter registration is paper based to one where voter registration is digital, we have to be sure that we do not put barriers up that prevent people with disabilities from being able to take advantage of the convenience of online voter registration. That train of thought moves on into other aspects of voting as well. Informational websites to give people instructions on how to register to vote, for example, also need to be accessible. And then certainly any effort to create online ballots must ensure accessibility so that people with disabilities do not face discrimination when they try to cast a virtual ballot. Technology is used in many other phases of state and local government too. For example, your city might let people pay their municipal water bills online. Again, this presents opportunities by making the payment of a municipal water bill something that someone can do any time of the day or night, and a person can pay their bill from anywhere that they can connect to the internet. State and local governments also use technology to communicate with their citizens. And again, when this communication is available, we need to make sure that it is also accessible. Technology is also a key part of just about every phase of employment, from finding a job to applying for a job and on through to benefits information and enrollment, as well as day-to-day productivity. Technology is used almost everywhere. Certainly one of the places where we need to avoid putting barriers up that would keep people with disabilities from participating is in our employment environments. Similarly, our educational environments rely more and more on technology in the classroom and in student life. In primary and secondary education, technology is used to supplement and directly deliver learning for students. Technology is also used to communicate with parents and guardians, as well as the students themselves. Parents can log into websites and monitor their students' progress through their classwork. Schools send emails that announce events and inform parents and guardians. In higher education, technology is used even more than it is in many primary and secondary educational environments. Prospective students can find information about institutions and academic programs on the institution's website. Students can find out about admission requirements and, in many cases, can directly apply for admission online. Once on campus, students participate in student life through social media and traditional websites that the institution uses to foster community on campus. In the classroom, technology can drive some or all of the students' interaction with their instructor. Learning management systems deliver educational materials that can be consumed at any time. Many instructors provide reading material that might have been read during class time in advance of the actual class meeting. Then, the classroom discussion focuses on the material, so the valuable classroom time is spent interacting instead of reading. In addition to these examples, students can often pay their on campus bills, participate in a campus meal plan, and find out about community, social, and wellness events that the campus provides, all from the comfort of their dorm rooms. And again, in each one of these instances, the institution needs to be sure that it does not discriminate against students that have disabilities. In the business world, technology is just as important not only from the employment perspective, but also from the day to day operations. Technology has worked its way into fields that we wouldn't necessarily think use technology very widely. Farmers and ranchers have begun to use technology to make their operations more efficient and to monitor trends in planting, harvesting, and raising animals. As automobiles use more and more onboard computer technology, the people that work on them have become more comfortable interacting with cars and trucks by using computers. And businesses large and small can use productivity and accounting software that used to be reserved only for Fortune 100 companies just a few years ago. With all of the technology used in these different ways to engage and communicate with employees, students, parents, residents, and other constituents, there comes a set of obligations. While much of the time technology is deployed strictly to solve a business problem, the reality is that any time technology is put in front of anyone, one of the key things to remember is how people actually use it. Technology really gives people with disabilities a lot of amazing opportunities as well. Some of the positive impacts that we think of for people without disabilities can be even more helpful to people that have disabilities. So, with that in mind, we have to be sure that we don't discriminate against anyone with the technology that we use. As more and more entities realize that technology gives them a great opportunity to include more people and to reach a bigger audience, entities also must recognize that technology can be a great tool to intentionally include more people with disabilities in those audiences. We have to be sure that no matter how we serve our customers or constituents, we must serve everyone fairly and equally. And with technology in particular, it is easier to do that than it might be in the built environment. Most people are familiar with the civil rights protections offered by laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and the Federal Rehabilitation Act. But I would emphasize that in both of these laws, there is a charge to both public and private sector entities, as well as employers, to avoid discriminating against people with disabilities. That charge is not limited to ensuring that our physical spaces and our paper based communications do not discriminate. The ADA and the Rehabilitation Act both speak to making sure that we do not discriminate in delivery of programs, services, and activities. Each also requires that we provide effective communication. The ADA does not say that we have to avoid discrimination and provide effective communication unless we use technology to do those things. In fact, the ADA is very flexible even though it was written over 25 years ago now. The ADA applies to all phases of employment in Title I, access to programs, services, and activities delivered by the public sector in Title II, and access to programs, services, and activities in places of public accommodation in Title III. The law includes technology when it is used to do any of those things. While the ADA does not give specific standards to help us to evaluate accessibility in technology, it does require the use of accessible technology in employment programs, services, or activities. Meanwhile, the Rehabilitation Act goes one step further than the ADA. Sections 503 and 504 of the Rehabilitation Act mirror Title I and Title II of the ADA. But Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act gives federal agencies and contractors more specific guidance about what accessible technology looks and acts like. As we discuss in our Section 508 webcast, Section 508 really focuses on procurement and acquisition of information and communication technology. Ultimately, though, the key point is that technology can and often does discriminate against people with disabilities. We basically end up with a building that has several floors but no elevator and stairs to the entrance. Just as this would be a violation of the civil rights of people with disabilities, inaccessible technology can also violate the civil rights of people with disabilities. While the ADA does not specifically address technology, we have a lot of guidance that comes from settlement agreements reached over the last several years. These reinforce the notion that technology does belong in the conversation about civil rights for people with disabilities. We have seen several complaints that involve both public and private institutions of higher education, municipal governments, as well as federal government agencies. In each case, the complaints themselves focus on alleged discrimination through the use of inaccessible technology. The settlement agreements reached to resolve these complaints are very informative and can really help us to fill in some of the gaps when it comes to determining how to make technology more accessible and what technology we need to make accessible. Some of the common themes in the settlement agreements include making sure that whenever an entity purchases or uses technology, the entity accounts for accessibility. This demonstrates why the topic of accessibility in procurement is so critically important. Settlement agreements also typically require that any technology that we create or acquire needs to be accessible from the beginning. More and more, we see the settlement agreements broaden to include emerging technologies like mobile apps. There's a really good list from Laura Carlson at the University of Minnesota that is very well maintained and has links to the details about private and public sector settlement agreements. You can find that by going to a web browser and typing in www.d.umn.edu/tilde LCARLSON/WCAGWG/settlements. Laura does a really good job of keeping the list up to date anytime a new settlement agreement is announced. One of the important lessons that the settlement agreements teach us is how much technology is included when we talk about accessibility. A settlement was reached in 2013 between Louisiana Tech University and the U.S. Department of Justice. Other settlement agreements have happened with other institutions of higher education and other entities that I mentioned before. In each case, we see a scope very similar to the one detailed in the Louisiana Tech Agreement. This settlement agreement says that the university shall conduct a review of the accessibility of its technology and instructional materials, and shall ensure that, from the effective date of the settlement agreement, all technology, including websites, instructional materials, and online courses, and other electronic and information technology for use by students or prospective students is accessible. The long and short of that is that our entire technology environment needs to be accessible. So we have a challenge, and that is to make sure that all the different platforms and tools that we use support accessibility so that we can create accessible materials. The challenge includes making sure that everything that we buy or use is accessible. And there can be two audiences that benefit from this challenge. There's oftentimes an internal audience, so the people that manage our website for us need to be able to use the tools we provide in order to manage the website. That means that the tools should be accessible to those individuals. That way, we do not face a situation where we discriminate against current or potential employees in some way. We also need to be sure that the people that consume the technology that we provide find those technology environments to be accessible. While this is a challenge, it is not a challenge that we cannot overcome. One of the best ways that we can begin to address the challenge is to work accessibility into our procurement process. Whether our procurement process is large and involves a lot of policy, checks, and balances, or it is small and involves one person, building accessibility into the process gives us a fantastic foundation that supports creating more accessible technology. When accessibility finds its way into our procurement processes, we are well positioned to avoid providing inaccessible technology to both our internal and external audiences. Just remember that accessibility follows technology everywhere. Like a family of geese where the young geese follow mama goose all over the pond, accessibility follows technology everywhere that we provide it. That does make this subject somewhat intimidating, but now we will begin to discuss how to break this down and make it something that we can do. In general, we need to think about accessibility from the very beginning if we want accessibility to really integrate into what we do. Processes do not have to be incredibly formal for us to successfully work accessibility into them. But we do need to avoid making accessibility something that we bolt on at the end. There are a lot of reasons for that. Mainly, if accessibility is something that we add on at the end, then there is a really good chance that it is not going to get done. It is very likely that we will run out of time and have to go ahead and move forward with the purchase and say, well, worry about accessibility after we get the product in place. But it's too late at that point if the product does not have good accessibility support. We need to make sure that accessibility is more than just a checkbox in our process. In organizations large and small, it is important to make sure that you account for accessibility whether you have one central procurement office or not. In decentralized environments, this may take more training and awareness, but it is still very much doable. The last point is to understand that it is not a good idea to assume that a product is accessible based on information that you have read about the product or who uses it already. Many of us who work in accessibility have spoken to vendors, and the vendors have said that several state or federal entities already use their product. So they reason that the product is all good as far as accessibility is concerned. Then, as we ask questions and test the product, we find accessibility barriers. If a vendor's website shows that they have sold their product to a number of different institutions of higher education, state agencies, or federal agencies, you might feel more comfortable about talking about accessibility with the vendor, but you still need to be sure that accessibility is specifically addressed. So, who is responsible for what? This is one of the most common questions that people ask when it comes to third party vendor supplied technology tools. Well, the entity that decides to use the product or service is the one that actually bears the legal responsibility to be sure that the product or service is accessible. What we see in Section 508 and many of the state statutes that are modeled after Section 508 is a requirement to acquire the most accessible product that meets the business needs. We do not see a requirement that we find an accessible product no matter what. But we still need to balance that reality with the possibility of violating the civil rights of someone with a disability. So it is up to us to be sure that we fall in line with the ADA or the Rehabilitation Act if it applies to us. The vendors that create the products that we purchase or use do not actually have a legal obligation to make the product or service that they create accessible. The pressure to make the product or service accessible comes from the market. This is entirely demand driven. One way to think about it is the vendors are responsible for making products that we will actually buy. As more and more private and public entities demand accessibility from various vendors, we see vendors respond to that demand and make their products more accessible over time. When it comes down to it, though, the entities that are responsible for accessibility and technology are the entities that actually purchase or use the technology and put it out in front of an audience. With all of that said, now it's time to take a look at how to actually take this challenge on. There are a few different things that we will focus on to help to build a process up around accounting for accessibility in procurement and use decisions. One of the key areas to address is making sure that accessibility is in any procurement paperwork or contracts that you might have. As an example, if you have a request for proposal or RFP, then you want to be sure that you require some documentation from potential vendors in the RFP. This is something you can do if you put a purchase out through an RFP, and this is something you can do as you begin to talk to vendors about what their products do in general. Any kind of documentation that you get, you'll need to invest a little bit of time in to review. That typically also involves having a conversation with the vendor to get some questions answered about how their product meets the accessibility standards that you have specified. We need to evaluate vendor responses both in documentation that the vendor provides and any questions that they might answer through email, telephone call, or face to face meeting. In an ideal world, we would actually do some accessibility testing directly, but it is difficult to find a world so ideal. In general, there are a lot of variables that we cannot control when performing testing, and we might find that we do not have the resources to commit to testing every piece of software that we consider for purchase or use. In the end, it is important to make sure that we document whatever steps we can take and whatever we find through that process. Finally, we are going to weigh our findings about accessibility in with the other factors that we have identified through our purchase decision process. Remember that accessibility is going to be one of the determining factors, but that it might not be the only determining factor that we might use when making a decision. The way that this looks from the paperwork side has a lot to do with how formal your purchasing process actually is. That may have a lot to do with how large of an entity you are part of. But if you have any kind of an internal product or service request document, then it is a good idea to ask a few questions in that request that will help to highlight the need for accessibility. Especially in large organizations, there is a really good chance that you will have to prioritize the work and ask questions about the intended audience for the technology tool and how the tool will be used. These are important factors that will help you to understand how important accessibility is in your purchase or use decision. Anytime you put out a request for proposal or specify functional requirements for a vendor, it is important to be sure that accessibility is specifically mentioned. And it is important not only in paperwork, but also in conversations that you have with prospective vendors. You also need to be sure that the vendor specifically addresses accessibility when they answer your RFP or informal request. You can also build accessibility into any kind of requirements documentation that you might put together. If you're going to purchase a new accounting system, then you are probably going to sit down with the people who will use it and talk to them about what it should do. There is a good chance that you will share this requirement documentation with potential vendors as well, so it makes sense that you use this as another opportunity to highlight the importance of accessibility. Maybe your organization creates a scope of work for technology procurement or use projects when the project is not large enough to go out to an RFP. Again, this is another place where we would want to include specific language about accessibility. Certainly, if a contract is involved, then you want to be sure that accessibility is one of the requirements that are in the contract language itself. Remember that there is not any kind of legal pressure on the vendors to create more accessible products. The pressure has to come from us, the customer, and often the only way that we can get out of a situation where a product is not accessible is to have a clause in the contract that allows us to cancel the contract if that is the case. Without this language in a contract, an organization will be hard pressed to move away from a vendor that will not improve the accessibility of its product. As a result, the organization is stuck with an inaccessible technology until that contract expires. The organization is also not in a position to negotiate any accessibility enhancements to the product without strong contract language in place. There's quite a bit of example language out there that you can reference when creating language for RFPs or contracts. To get an idea of what language might look like, you can go to www.ncdae.org/resources/articles/procurement.php, and there's a samples section on that page. You can also do a Google search to find additional examples that might fit your environment better. It is a good idea to specify the technology accessibility standard set that you will use to determine accessibility in a product. What kind of documentation should you request from a vendor? The most common is called a Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT. In some cases, you may be able to find a VPAT on a vendor's website. Especially in the case of larger vendors like Adobe or Microsoft, this document will probably be publicly available. For many, if not most of these vendors' products, you will be able to download and review the VPAT directly from the vendor's website. Usually, you can do a quick search on a website for VPAT or Section 508 or WCAG and find documentation that a vendor has prepared to document accessibility support in their products. A lot of the time, you will have to request this documentation from the vendor directly if it is not available on their website. In many cases, you will be the first person to ever ask for this documentation. Even vendors who have done a lot of work in the public sector before may not have had anyone ask about accessibility. But having accessibility support documented and that documentation in front of you for review is key to starting the conversation about accessibility. If you receive documentation from the vendor, then there are a few quick things that you can do to be sure that the conversation is headed in the right direction. The first thing is to be sure that the documentation is current. It is not uncommon to ask for a VPAT and receive something that applies to a version of the software that was available 2 years ago. Well, 2 years is a long time when it comes to software development, and there's a really good chance that the product does not look or act very much like it did 2 years ago. If you encounter that situation, then you should politely request that the vendor send an updated version of the VPAT. There are additional factors that you should keep in mind and evaluate when you receive accessibility documentation from the vendor. In addition to a software version number or a date, it is important to look at the responses and see just how specific they are. We will go through a couple of examples here in just a minute. I frequently ask vendors to specifically describe how their product provides support for accessibility in particular pieces of the software. A very good way to vet a product for accessibility is to ask for a demonstration of the accessibility features that the vendor documents for you. The vendor should be able to walk through some of the accessibility features through a remote demonstration without much trouble. This is a great way for you to see firsthand how the product actually works. Throughout all of these steps, it is important to keep in mind that you do not necessarily have to have a lot of advanced technical or accessibility expertise to perform this vetting process. It does help to know a little bit about accessibility, but for a first round of questions, it is safe to assume that you can handle the conversation, even if you are not a technology or accessibility guru. So what kind of questions might we ask? What kinds of answers might we expect? What kind of follow-up questions might we want to send out to vendors as we talk about accessibility? Well, let's take a look at a couple of examples. In this situation, we are shopping for software that will let people register to vote online. We have asked for and received a VPAT from each one of the vendors that we are considering. The VPAT itself is set up to show a set of accessibility standards, with room for a vendor to indicate whether their product complies with each individual standard. In this example, we are going to use examples from a VPAT that uses the Section 508 standard set. One of the standards in Section 508 says that a text equivalent for every non-text element shall be provided via alternative text, long description, or in other content. What this means is that any sort of visual element needs to have some kind of text equivalent. Text equivalents can be provided in several different ways. In this situation, we will assume that we are looking at a linked image. In other words, a picture that has a link embedded in it. This lets a system user click on the picture and follow a link that will take them to a different part of the software or website. Let's say that our online voter registration software has a picture at the bottom of the screen that looks just like a button. This picture has the phrase, "Submit your voter registration information" on it. Since this is an image, the text telling someone what happens when they click on the image is not actually text at all. It is part of the image itself. This has a number of implications when it comes to accessibility. People with low vision who zoom in on their screen may find that the text is so pixelated that it is virtually impossible to read. People using screen readers or braille displays will find that the text in the image is completely hidden from them. In either of these cases, the functionality of this button will be lost to a number of system users. In order to make sure that the system is more usable, the vendor needs to provide a text-based equivalent of the information found on this button. However, it is entirely possible that the vendor will reply in their accessibility documentation and say that they do indeed meet this standard about text equivalence. That may very well be true in other parts of the software. But for this critical piece of functionality, the piece that actually allows someone to submit their voter registration information online, the vendor's product misses the mark. To make sure that we get a better idea of how and where the vendor uses accessibility techniques, I would ask a simple question such as, how do you assign text equivalents in images, especially in any linked images? What I'm looking for here is an answer that says that the vendor will use the alternative text attribute to describe linked images. I may not get much detail back in an answer. That may indicate that I need to set up some time with the vendor to talk through this in more detail. I can also keep going back and forth to get more and more detail from the vendor, but it may be more efficient to set up some time and ask the vendor to demonstrate specifically how they support this accessibility feature. Our second example deals with another standard from the Section 508 standard set that says when pages utilize scripting languages to display content or to create interface elements, the information provided by the script shall be identified with functional text that can be read by assistive technology. That is another way to say that anything that we can use with the mouse should also be usable from the keyboard. Now, there's more to it than that, but for this example, we will use this relatively simplified explanation. In this case, the vendor might again say, yes, we support this functionality. My question will be pretty general, and I might say, can we see this in a live demonstration? Because the only way to really account for this is to either test the software ourselves or see the software in action through a demonstration. In a demonstration, I will ask for the vendor to walk through performing certain functions within the software only using the keyboard and not using the mouse. The goal is to verify that a mouse is not required to let someone use the system successfully and independently. For example, I might look to be sure that any kind of pop-up windows that have error messages or helpful information can be closed using the keyboard. I want to make sure that anything that I can click with the mouse can be found and used just using the keyboard. This might require a vendor to put in a little bit of extra time, and there's no reason at all to feel guilty about asking for that. Without taking these kinds of steps and doing our due diligence to make sure that we account for accessibility in products that we might buy, we are doing a disservice to ourselves and ultimately doing a disservice to everyone that might use the product once we deploy it out into the wild. There are several common barriers in websites and software that we encounter when we start doing accessibility testing. One of the most common is in error handling. Error messages are there to try to make sure that people can recover and continue working on a system when they enter the wrong kind of information into a form field. Ideally, the error messages are concise, detailed, and specific so that the message can really help people to go back and correct their mistake. Error messages also need to be available for people who use screen readers or braille displays or might have low vision and have zoomed their displays up quite a bit. Let's say that someone has put the wrong information into their online voter registration form. When they submit the form, the system just pops up an error that says, please correct the errors on this form. That is not a very helpful error message. And there is a really good chance you can make anyone who reads that message get pretty frustrated. But for people who have cognitive disabilities, low vision, or blindness, this presents a barrier. It is really important to be sure that error messages are available to keyboard and assistive technology users. Again, this is something that you can ask a vendor to demonstrate if you do not have the resources to test for yourself. Another common barrier is making sure that form labels are associated with the entry fields or form controls that are on a form. Form labels should have an explicit relationship with the fields that they apply to. This is something that happens behind the screen on any form that you use online. But there are times when the two are explicitly related to one another, and there are times when they just happen to be in close proximity on the screen. If someone is using a screen reader, then the screen reader is going to have to guess which label matches up with which field, unless all of the fields and labels are explicitly related to each other. Sometimes the screen reader will guess correctly, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes, depending on the screen reader that you use, it won't even try to guess because it knows that it is going to cause problems. You can ask the vendor to demonstrate this, or you can test this directly. One of the easiest ways to test to be sure that these relationships are explicit does not involve a specific testing tool at all. If you are using a mouse, then put the mouse pointer over the text label and click on the label text with the mouse. If the field that you are testing is a text entry field, then the text cursor should appear in the text field. If you are testing a checkbox or radio button, then when you click on the form label, the checkbox should check or the radio button should be selected. This is one of the many advantages of having the form field labels explicitly associated with the form fields that they apply to. Not only do we make form fields usable by people that use screen readers, but we also make them much more usable to people that have impairments in their fine motor control and may not be able to effectively move the mouse onto something as small as a checkbox or radio button. We also see barriers that come from the way that color is used. We need to be sure the font colors contrast highly enough with the color of the background behind the font. This is something that a lot of people don't pay much attention to, and it really creates significant barriers for people with a wide variety of different disabilities. Fortunately, testing tools that let us test color contrast are widely available, often free, and easy to use. There are several out there, but I often use contrast checkers from the Paciello Group, WebAIM, and Juicy Studio, among others. You can find any of those with a quick Google search. We talked a little bit in our first VPAT vetting example about alternative text or text equivalence. Testing web applications and websites has shown that this still seems to be a pretty common oversight. On one hand, alternative text is the one thing that many web designers and software developers know to use to try to make what they create more accessible. But that does not mean that it always gets done. So you do want to focus on text equivalence in any demonstrations, testing, or in your vetting process to try to make sure that the vendor specifically describes or shows how alternative text is used and what kind of visual elements are used in the software or website. Another place in software and websites where we still see barriers to accessibility is in general keyboard support. We talked briefly about this in our second VPAT example. You need to be able to do everything from the keyboard that you can do from the mouse. While testing using a keyboard will not account for every interaction that you might see from other input devices like a switch or sip and puff device, if you can perform the same functions using a keyboard that you can using a mouse, then there's a much better chance that other input devices will also work. It seems pretty simple to make sure that everything we can do from the mouse can also be done from the keyboard, but it is important to ask for a demonstration or test for yourself to see how someone can use every feature of the software or website when only using a keyboard. Something as simple as closing a dialog box may not actually be possible when using anything other than a mouse, and this is easy to overlook when we think about checking for accessibility directly or in a demonstration. Another common thing that we encounter is software that does not provide support for captions or transcripts for multimedia. If a learning management system, web content management system, or any other platform lets you upload video or audio to share across the web, then we need to be sure that it has the support to let us also upload a transcript or closed captions. Now, you can embed captions in a video, but ideally the captions will be separate so that someone can turn them on or off. This way, the control of the captions is in the hands of the people who are consuming the video content. And in a lot of cases, remember that captions can be enough of a distraction for people that they need to be able to turn them off in order to consume all of the content from the video. So be sure that the platform has good support for transcription and captions as part of this vetting process. Those are some of the most common barriers to accessibility that you might encounter, but it is not a definitive list. As you work with vendors and go through this vetting process a few times, you will get a better idea of not only what to look for, but how to look for particular barriers to access. When it comes to looking at this documentation, you might find that different VPAT documents reference different sets of standards. Section 508 standards are certainly acceptable. In most cases, your state's accessibility standards should also be acceptable, and you may well have documents to help with your accessibility vetting process. These may be available to you through your state's Information Technology or Accessibility Group. You might also find that the VPAT references the WCAG 2.0 A and AA standards. Again, this is probably an acceptable set of standards to use in this document. This is an area where your legal counsel might have an opinion. So if in doubt, then check with them to be sure that you use an acceptable set of standards as the foundation for your accessibility vetting. But vendors may not have a VPAT on file, and they may not really be in a position to fill one out if you send it back to them and ask them to do so. There are other ways to look for documented evidence of the accessibility support in the product that you are evaluating. What you can do is ask a vendor to provide another type of documentation that speaks specifically to the kind of accessibility support that the product provides. However, the VPAT format is often easier for a vendor to fill out and return if they don't have anything ready to go. Sometimes you encounter a situation where vendors actually have a very accessible product, but they do not have anything that fits the VPAT format. But they are actually more specific in their accessibility documentation than what a VPAT would require them to be. I have encountered vendor accessibility statements that are far more detailed than what I would expect from a VPAT. Certainly in this situation, this documentation will suffice when I sit down and evaluate the accessibility of their product. The point is that if you are comfortable doing so, then you can accept forms of documentation other than the VPAT as long as they provide you with enough information to evaluate the accessibility in the product. A lack of documentation can also mean that the vendor doesn't really know how to answer the questions that you have asked. Or maybe the vendor provides you with a VPAT that is not very detailed and struggles to answer questions that you ask. The struggle could come from a variety of different sources. It may be that you just need to get the IT folks talking to other IT folks. This is a situation where you might need to team up with your own IT department and talk about what kinds of questions to ask to get a better idea of how accessible the product is. You might also place more emphasis on the importance of having a live demonstration done, or possibly even having a demonstration set up that you can use to perform live testing. If the process becomes one where you observe accessibility support through demonstrations or hands-on testing, then you should document your findings so that you have a set of accessibility information that is consistent with others that you've acquired in other procurement efforts. This whole conversation can go in a lot of different directions. Our best case is that the VPAT shows really good support for accessibility and that any questions that we fire back to the vendor are answered thoroughly and completely. We also find in product demonstration or live testing confirmation that the product does have a lot of good accessibility support. More often than not, we come in a little bit short of the best case. That is not necessarily a bad thing. In an average situation, we might find that there are some shortcomings with accessibility by looking at documentation, communicating with the vendor, or through demonstrations or testing. At this point, we can ask the vendor for their roadmap to removing accessibility barriers from their software. This should also include a timeline and some specifics about how the vendor is going to address the barriers that we have identified through the vetting process. We also need to be sure that the vendor's timeline is something that we can hold the vendor to. Typically, software vendors release new updates to their software on a fixed schedule. Accessibility enhancements can often be tied to these release schedules. But the vendor can also provide us with a separate roadmap that is specific and exclusive to accessibility enhancements. Having this roadmap to a more accessible product as a part of our purchasing documentation ensures that everyone knows who is responsible for what and when things will get done. It also puts us as the purchasing entity in a position where we can anticipate and plan for any accommodations that might be required while barriers are being removed. At the other end of the spectrum is a worst-case scenario where we do not get a VPAT or other documentation back from a vendor, We don't see any support for accessibility in a VPAT, and worse yet, the vendor is not willing to do anything related to planning to remove accessibility barriers. At this point, we can find ourselves in a difficult position because this often indicates that we should look for a vendor that is more willing to address accessibility in their product if they have not already done so. The good news is that more and more vendors, no matter how narrow of a niche we're shopping in, have begun to address accessibility in their products. This means that there are fewer excuses for procuring entities not to account for accessibility in their procurement processes. With that said, weighing accessibility into your decision-making process becomes an even bigger issue when you don't see good accessibility support in your available options. If you provide a product that does not have good accessibility support that comes from a vendor that is not willing to improve accessibility support in the product, then there is a very good chance that you are going to discriminate against someone with a disability who uses that technology. And you need to weigh that into your decision making to determine if you want to continue to work with that vendor or look around for another product that still meets the business need, but also proves to be more accessible. In any case, there are still likely to be situations where a barrier is not removed. As we all know, the best plans don't always work out for some reason or another. So while a vendor might take their contractual obligation to make the product more accessible very seriously, they can still see unexpected delays pop up. At this point, again, you have to look at the relationship that you have with the vendor and the work that they have done up to this point. Then you can determine if you can continue to trust their word that they will work to remove these particular barriers. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, when you look at a vendor's plan to remove accessibility barriers from their software, then you need to factor in how much of a burden it might be for you to provide reasonable accommodations during the remaining time that the vendor is working on the software. Is it possible to actually provide a reasonable accommodation? Is this something that you can sustain over the course of several months or maybe a year or more? Possibly the most important question is, will your accommodations actually provide substantially equivalent ease of use to your consumers? Just to stress this again, if we talk about accessibility very early on in our procurement process, then no matter how the conversation goes, we are in a much better position to plan ahead. And that planning ahead can include providing accommodations. It can include additional time that we might need to take to go out and research other products. In any situation where we talk about accessibility early on, we put ourselves into a much better position. Another thing to remember is that software updates do indeed arrive pretty frequently. If you use the Firefox web browser, then almost weekly you see a notification that Firefox has provided an update. Adobe products update very, very frequently, and we are in a time where even smaller vendors update their products pretty regularly. We might expect that any time an update is made, it will result in improved accessibility in the updated product, but that is not always the case. In fact, one change that improves the product in one way can result in breaking accessibility somewhere else. Accessibility may be broken in one or in many locations as a result of this change. So, this process of vetting and continuing conversations with vendors about accessibility is most certainly an ongoing one. It is rarely something that we only do one time. At the very least, you should come back around to this conversation about accessibility annually. Most contracts between entities and vendors, especially in the public sector, have some kind of annual renewal associated with them. Even if the contract is spread out over the course of multiple years, an annual renewal is common. This annual renewal gives us a great opportunity to address accessibility again and check in to see how vendors are doing in making their product more accessible, or at least keeping it as accessible as it was when we first purchased it. If a vendor has given us a roadmap and timeline to removing accessibility barriers, then we can talk to them about that more specifically when it is time for contract renewal. This is also a time to be sure that we have a conversation, even if the product has not had significant barriers to begin with, because again, sometimes barriers are introduced when a vendor updates their system. Up to this point, we've talked about new products, new procurement efforts where we are trying to find a new product that will automate a process to improve the way that we engage our constituents. What about existing products and existing services that we already have in place? The contract renewal period is a great time to make sure that accessibility remains a vendor's focus. It is also an excellent opportunity to introduce accessibility to a vendor whose product you already use. The conversation with an existing vendor can be a little bit awkward because, on one hand, the charge to acquire accessible technology has really been in place for a long time. On the other hand, if you bring this up to a long-time vendor, then they may not be aware of your obligation, and they may wonder why in the world you've started to talk about this now. But it is relatively easy to justify by saying something as simple as, we are putting an increased focus on civil rights, and we understand and want to emphasize the importance of accessible technology and protecting the civil rights of people with disabilities. In most cases, the vendor should not push back too much, especially when you let them know what is driving your focus on accessible technology. Vendors should become supportive. You should expect vendors to react very differently to your bringing technology accessibility up to them. In some cases, you may need to educate a vendor about what accessible technology is. And in a situation like that, you can always reach out directly to ATAP for some additional support. If you have a good relationship with the vendor and they provide a product that is valuable to your organization, then it is probably worth the time to educate the vendor about accessibility. In the end, you will end up with a more accessible product over time, and the vendor will have a selling point for their product that may make it more unique among its competition. I've talked a couple of times about weighing accessibility into our decision-making process. Remember that our goal is to find the most accessible product that meets the business need. So now we will talk about some factors to consider when you weigh accessibility into your decision-making. We account for factors such as who's going to use the product and how important the product is to the people who will use it. If we continue to think about online voter registration, then we are talking about something that is absolutely critical to people's ability to vote. And if we are going to provide a system that lets anyone register to vote online, then we need to be sure that everyone who tries to register to vote online can do so independently. So this situation is one where accessibility will be a very important factor as you make your decision. Another thing to consider is the number of people that will use this technology resource. If we consider online voter registration, then there's a very good chance that a whole bunch of people are going to take advantage of this system that lets them register to vote from the comfort of their living room. That will reinforce the notion that we should weigh accessibility very highly when we evaluate possible products to meet this need. As we think through this thoroughly, we think again about how we might be able to provide accommodations for someone that might need them. In this instance, independence in all aspects of voting is particularly important in the context of civil rights. Any accommodation should provide substantially equivalent ease of use for the person that receives the accommodation. Given that an online system will be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffing up to provide immediate support for someone that might have a problem outside of business hours is an expensive proposition. It is also a proposition that takes away from someone's ability to independently register to vote. It is reasonable to conclude that providing an accommodation that will allow someone to register to vote with substantially equivalent ease of use requires that the online voter registration system be accessible to begin with. When we talk about accessibility in technology, we do still see the concept of undue burden. An undue burden is a concept that is found in both the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA. An undue burden is something that involves significant expense or has a significant adverse effect on the operations of the entity. Entities are not asked to do anything that would cause an undue burden. When we evaluate undue burden, especially when we talk about undue burden on financial grounds, we need to remember that the accounting is done at the organizational level. In other words, if you work for the Information Technology Office in the State Election Board and you are charged with finding a vendor to provide online voter registration software, then you may look at your IT budget and say, gosh, I don't think we can afford that. But you must remember that any claim of undue burden will probably be evaluated at the agency level and not the departmental level. You have to look at the resources available to the entire agency and not just to one department. One of the other challenges in claiming undue burden when it comes to acquiring accessible software is that it is often less expensive to make software more accessible than it is to make sidewalks, doorways, and buildings more accessible. There's more flexibility in software than there is in the built environment. The other piece to consider is whether enabling better access will cause a fundamental alteration to a program, service, or activity. This is again evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And in technology, I think this is one of the trickier pieces to successfully argue for, because we usually bring technology in to improve the way that we offer programs, services, or activities. Making the technology accessible would rarely, if ever, give anybody grounds to say that accessibility enhancements cause a fundamental alteration to what we are going to offer using this technology. A key point to remember is that, at least in the public sector, none of the claims of undue burden or fundamental alteration has resulted in a complaint alleging discrimination being thrown out. And one last note, Remember that when you talk about an undue burden, it can be an undue burden to provide accommodations instead of making the technology more accessible. Again, you still want to make sure that the program, service, or activity that you offer or the communication you provide does not discriminate. It can be very difficult to find resources to provide an effective accommodation for something that is technology driven. Just like with our online voter registration example, where the ability to register to vote is available every day of the year and at all times of the day and night, providing an accommodation may prove to be a burden that the agency simply cannot bear. Instead of focusing on ways to get out from under the obligation to provide accessible technology, we should focus more on ways to reach out to and assist vendors in making the products that we purchase or use more accessible. One quick note before we wrap up, and that is a reminder to answer the survey question that appears right below this video. There's only one question, and it is really helpful for the Association of Technology Act programs to get this single question answered by each and every one of the participants in these webcasts. Please do that for us so that we will have a better idea of what kind of technical assistance materials we can provide for you. With that, I invite you to contact me directly if you have any questions about accessibility in procurement. It is a big topic. There can be a lot to it, and we are more than happy to help in any way that we can. You can reach me through email at rgcarr@okstate.edu, by calling Oklahoma Able Tech at 888-885-5588, or through social media. AbleTech is on Facebook at OKAbleTech and on Twitter with the handle at OKAbleTech. You can also reach me directly on Twitter at RGCARRJR. Please don't hesitate to ask questions if you have them, and we look forward to having you participate in the additional webcasts that we will continue to provide over the course of the next several months. Thank you very much.